Hi, my name is Fabrício Henrique Rodrigues, and I'll present the paper called Upper-Level Types of Occurrent based on the Principle of Ontological Conservation. First, I will talk about what's an occurrent, then I will discuss how to delimit occurrence, then I will review the notion of constitution and propose the notion of ontological conservation. And in light of these notions, I will propose a refined definition of occurrence and discuss how to use it to delimit occurrence. Then I'll present the types of occurrence that we found, and finally I'll present our concluding remarks. So, what's an occurrent? We can divide the world into two sorts of things. The continuants, or roughly speaking, objects and their properties, which are things that exist in time, so that they are wholly present whenever they are present. And occurrents, sometimes referred to as processes or events, which are things that happen in time, accumulating temporal parts. So, if you take a continuant, for example, a person or a runner in this case, at any moment during its existence, we will have the whole person present at that moment. On the other hand, if you take an occurrent, like a run, at any moment of its occurrence while it's happening, we won't have the whole run, the whole occurrent present at that moment, but just a temporal part of it. A further view on occurrence regards them as transitions between situations. And a situation in this case is a configuration of a part of a reality that's understood as a whole. Situations are instantaneous and bound to specific time points. For example, here we have an event of taking a step. That's a transition between an initial situation in which a person is going to touch the ground with one foot and a final situation in which the same person is touching the ground with the other foot after a bodily movement. Now, let's talk about some issues on delimiting occurrents. If occurrents are transitions between situations, which situations can an occurrent link? Let's make an analogy with continuants. If we take a snapshot of a tree now and a snapshot of the same tree later, we could say that these two snapshots are tracing a single valid object. However, if you take a snapshot just of the trunk of the tree now and a snapshot just of the branch of the tree later, we wouldn't say that these two snapshots are tracing a single valid object. We could say the same about occurrence. It's not any two situations that would make a valid occurrent. For example, if you take a situation in which Usain Bolt is taking the first step on a run, and a later situation in which Elton John in another place is playing the last chord of a song, we wouldn't say that there's an occurrent that links, that's a transition between these two situations. However, for sure, we would say that there's an occurrent that's a transition between a situation in which Usain Bolt is taking the first step on a run and the situation in which Usain Bolt is crossing the end line of this run. So, we need to establish a criterion for valid occurrence. For example, we could say that occurrents are transitions between situations that involve the same continuants. It accepts the event of Usain Bolt starting and finishing a run, and it also excludes some unintended occurrents, like the one involving Usain Bolt and Elton John, since neither of them is present on both situations. However, this criterion would also exclude some occurrents that we would like to accept. For example, if situations must comprise the same objects, how to account for occurrence of creation? Take the event of an artist creating a statue. The core of this event is precisely the fact that there's a statue in the final situation that was not present on the initial situation, and that violates this exemplified criterion. To devise a better criterion, let's take a step back and take a look on the notions of constitution and ontological conservation. Constitution is the relation between something and what it's made of. That's different from composition and mereological relations. This relation holds when an individual is in some favorable circumstances so that a new individual comes into existence. In this case, we say that we have a constituent individual on a lower ontological level that constitutes a constituted individual on a higher ontological level. As an example, we can take a collection of atoms of gold. That's just a mere logical sum of these atoms that could be spread all across the universe. However, if we establish a metallic bond tying these atoms together, we will now have a portion of gold constituted of this collection of atoms. And this portion of gold would have a color, a malleability, and other properties that are different from those of the simple collection of atoms. Now, if we take this portion of gold in solid state and shape it as the upper part of a human figure, we would have a bust, a kind of statue, that is constituted of this portion of gold. With that, there are potentially many levels of constitution. So, something on an ontological level is constituted of something on a lower ontological level, that's constituted of something on a lower ontological level, and so on. Then, there are two possibilities for the length of this constitution chain. It is either endless, and then it turtles all the way down, or it's finite, and there is an eventual ground level, with something as a basic ontological substrate on this level. And this is the view that we assume in this work. Following this view, every object is either a constituted object or a portion of basic ontological substrate. And if the amount of basic ontological substrate is fixed, nor created nor destroyed, occurrents are just rearrangements of the basic ontological substrate on different layers of constitution. And with that, we propose the principle of ontological conservation. That's inspired on the law of conservation of mass, and says that, given a closed system, the amount of basic ontological substrate remains the same along the time. Now we can go back to the issue of delimiting occurrents. Given the ontological conservation in a closed system, the situations that supersede one another within the system are just different configurations of the ontological substrate that's circumscribed by the system. And with that we can refine the definition of occurrent to say that an occurrent is a transition between situations that comprise the same maximal amount of basic ontological substrate. This refined definition of occurrent can help us to approximate the set of valid models to the set of intended models. The definition excludes unintended occurrents, like the one involving Usain Bolt and Elton John, since the ontological substrate that constitutes Usain Bolt is not present in both situations, and the same for the substrate that constitutes Elton John. And definition also accepts the occurrence that we would like to accept. For example, in the event of Usain Bolt starting and finishing a run, the ontological substrate that constitutes Usain Bolt is present in both situations. And in the event of the creation of a statue, the ontological substrate that constitutes the statue that's present on the final situation, it's also present on the initial situation. Besides accepting and rejecting models of occurrence, the refined definition of occurrent can also help us to fix problematic models. When you have an occurrent model with unbalanced situations regarding the ontological substrate, the definition indicates that there must be some overlooked participants in some of the situations. Let's take the example of an event of appearance of a water puddle on a sidewalk. Let's model as a transition from a situation comprising a dry sidewalk to a situation comprising the sidewalk and the water puddle on it. The ontological substrate that constitutes the sidewalk is present in both situations. But how about the water puddle? There is nothing on the initial situation that's constituted of the same ontological substrate that constitutes the water on the second situation. However, by the proposed definition of occurrent, the substrate constituting the water in the final situation must also be present on the initial situation in some form. That may be as rain clouds, or as ice cubes that have melted, or the water itself may have leaked from a broken pipe. With that, the proposed definition of occurrent can provide guidelines to fix problematic models. Given the notions discussed so far, we can proceed to the types of occurrent we propose in this work. They are based on three types of property. First, the ordinary properties, which are neither related to identity nor to favorable circumstances of the object. For example, for a statue, its size and weight. Second, we have the identity-related properties, which are those ones that, if modified, cause a change in the identity of the object. Again, for a statue, it would include the figure that's represented by the statue. For example, if you have a statue that represents a person and you reshape the statue to represent another person, you no longer have the same statue. And finally, we have the favorable properties, which are those ones that, if modified, establish or dissolve the favorable circumstances for the existence of an object. For example, for a bust, the shape and the physical state of its constituent material are favorable properties for its existence. On the remaining slides, these properties will be represented as follows. Here we have an object on a given ontological level. On its upper left corner, we will have its ID. On the left side, we will have the identity-related properties. On central white part, we will have its ordinary properties. And on the right side, we will have its favorable properties. And in case these favorable properties establish the favorable circumstances to the constitution of another higher level object, this constituted object will appear embracing the original object. Here we have a representation for the bust example. On the upper left corner, we can see that it's Caesar's bust, and as an identity-related property, we have the represented figure with the value Julius Caesar. And here we have the favorable properties that establish the favorable circumstances for the existence of the bust. And they include the shape of it, the shape of the constituent material as an upper human body, and the physical state of the constituent material as a solid state. We divide the occurrence according to the type of the property that's affected by the occurrent. So you have states, simple chains, transformations, and existential occurrence. And this last one we further divide into creation and destruction. In states, the linked situations only differ in their temporal location, so that no property is affected by this type of occurrent. Simple chains only affect ordinary properties, either changing their values or adding or removing properties of this type. So we have a situation with an object that's constituted of another one, and these objects have two ordinary properties, P1 and P2, and then we have an event that's a transition from this situation to another one, in which the property P1 was removed, the property P3 was added, and the value of the property P2 was changed from X to W. Applying this type of event to the case of the bust, we have the event of price appreciation. That's the transition from a situation in which the bust has a price, in this case $20 million, to another situation in which it has a higher price, in this case $30 million. The third type of occurrent is transformation, which changes the identity-related properties of an object. So in this kind of occurrent, we have a transition from a situation comprising an object with a given value for its identity-related properties to another situation with another object with a different value for its identity-related properties. Since the values for the identity-related properties are different, the identity of these objects are different, so they are not the same. And we say that the object on the initial situation was transformed into the object on the second situation. Applying this type of occurrent to the bust case, we can have the event of recycling. That's exemplified here with a transition from a situation in which you have a bust that represents the figures of Caesar to a situation that comprises a bust that represents the figure of Plato. So since the figure that's represented by the statue, it's an identity-related property, the difference in this property makes these two statues different ones. So we say that the Caesar's bust was transformed into Plato's bust. The last upper type of occurrent is the existential occurrent, which changes the favorable properties of objects. and it may happen in two possible ways. It may be a creation, which creates or modifies favorable properties to establish favorable circumstances for a new object to come into existence. So this kind of event is a transition from a situation in which we have an object on a given level, and then this object acquires some properties so that it establishes the favorable circumstances to an object on a higher ontological level to appear. Applying the creation type to the bust case, we can think about the event of sculpting. That's a transition from a situation comprising a portion of gold shaped as a cube to a situation in which this portion of gold is shaped as the upper part of a human body, so that a bust comes into existence. Finally, an existential occurrent may be a destruction, which destroys or modifies favorable properties to dissolve the favorable circumstances for an object to exist. This kind of occurrent may be a transition from a situation comprising a constituted object supported by favorable properties on its constituent individual, and some of these properties, these favorable properties, is removed so that the constituted object no longer exists because the favorable circumstances are no longer present. An example of this type of occurrent applied to the bust case would be the melting event. That's a transition from a situation in which we have a bust that's constituted by a portion of gold in solid state, and this portion of gold is melted so that it acquires a liquid state, and being liquid, the favorable circumstances to the existence of a bust are gone, and then we no longer have the bust. The notions, definitions, and types proposed in this work provide guidelines for the ontological analysis and modeling of occurrents as transitions, intended to approximate the set of valid models to the set of intended ones. They do so by providing some criteria for assessing the correctness of models of occurrence. With the principle of ontological conservation, we arrived into an individuation criterion that allows us to exclude occurrences with unrelated situations and to review overlooked participants on problematic models. Our approach also seems to advance on previous efforts. On Guarino and Guizzardi's work, events were suggested to be what happens to a set of focal individual qualities. It seems to work very well for qualitative events, but it also seems to have some problems with existential events, because it's not possible to track the qualities of something that still doesn't exist, such as in the case of creation events, or to track the qualities of something that no longer exists, as in the case of destruction. Our proposal may allow to adjust this definition to have events as what happens to the properties of some conserved ontological substrate, allowing to encompass the existential occurrence, since the ontological substrate must be constant during the whole occurrence of the event. This is an ongoing work, so we plan to extend this framework to deal with intermediary situations, with the case of mixed type occurrence, and we plan also to apply this theory to some use cases. And we also plan to investigate the types of occurrent involving properties that are implicitly assumed to underlie occurrence involving objects, such as when we mention the creation, modification, and destruction of favorable properties. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, please send a message to the email that's written down on this slide. Cheers!